On a Tuesday morning in October of 1962, a man named Cecil Briggs drove his 1941 Farmall M into the equipment lot of the Piatt County International Harvester dealer in Monticello, Illinois, and asked what they would give him on trade. The service manager, a man named Denny Pugh, walked around the tractor. He looked at the hour meter, which had stopped working at 4,200 hours and had been dead for who knew how long. He looked at the rear tires, both worn to the cords. He looked at the hydraulic lift, which had developed a slow leak. He looked at the front axle, which had a shimmy at road speed. He stepped back. He said, "Cecil, that machine is done. I can do you 200 on trade toward the new 404. Maybe 250 if my boss is feeling good. Otherwise, you'd be better off dragging it to the scrap yard." Cecil Briggs was 44 years old. He had been farming 320 acres of Piatt County corn and soybeans since 1938. He had bought the Farmall M new in 1941 for $1,150, one of the first M's off the line that year. He had run it for 21 years. The hour meter had died at 4,200, but Cecil estimated the tractor was close to 9,000 hours by 1962. Not a low number for any engine. Extraordinary for a Farmall M that had been worked hard through 21 Illinois growing seasons. He said, "I'm not trading it." Denny said, "Cecil, that engine is shot." Cecil said, "The engine's tired. There's a difference between tired and shot." He drove the M home, pulled it into the shop, and started taking it apart. Let me tell you what Cecil found inside that engine, because what he found determines the rest of the story. The C264 engine in the Farmall M had run approximately 9,000 hours when Cecil pulled the head in October of 1962. At 9,000 hours, an engine that has been maintained carefully looks different from an engine that has been maintained carelessly. And what Cecil found inside was the record of 21 years of his own maintenance habits made visible in metal. The cylinder walls were worn. He measured them, 0.055 inches over the original bore diameter, which was beyond the service limit for continued operation without rebuilding, but not the catastrophic wear pattern of an engine that has been run dry or pushed past reasonable limits. Even wear across all four cylinders, the kind of wear that happens slowly and consistently when the oil is changed on schedule and the air cleaner is kept clean and the engine is not pushed into sustained overload. The pistons were worn, but intact. No scoring, no cracks. The rings were finished, no spring tension left. The reason the engine smoked going uphill and drank oil in hot weather. But the ringlands were good. The connecting rods were in specification. The crankshaft main journals measured within 0.002 inches of their original diameter. Extraordinary for 9,000 hours, the result of clean oil and no lubrication failures across 21 years of maintenance. Cecil stood over the engine and did an accounting. The block was sound. The crank was sound. The rods were sound. The head needed a valve job. 3 of the 8 valves were burned. The cylinders needed boring, new pistons, new rings, new rod bearings, new main bearings, new gasket set, head resurfaced, valve seats cut, new valves were burned. He wrote it down. He priced the parts through the IH dealer, through the Napa store in Monticello, through a machine shop in Decatur that did agricultural engine work. He wrote the machine shop work on a separate line. The total was $312. against the $1,150 he had paid for the tractor in 1941, against the trade offer of $200 to $250 that Denny Pugh had offered, against whatever the new 404 would have cost on the finance plan the dealer would have been happy to arrange. Cecil spent the winter of 1962 to 1963 on the rebuild. He bored the cylinders himself. He had bought a boring bar in 1955 and had used it on a neighbor's engine and knew what he was doing. He had the head resurfaced at the Decatur machine shop and had them cut the valve seats while it was there. He did the assembly himself, the way he had done everything mechanical on the farm since he was 17 years old. The engine started in February of 1963. Clean oil, no smoke, correct compression on all 4 cylinders. Cecil adjusted the carburetor and the timing and drove it out of the shop and into the February cold. It was a different machine from the one Denny Pugh had told him to scrap. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer and tell me in the comments, have you ever rebuilt something everyone else said was finished? Let me tell you about the second rebuild, because the second rebuild is where the story starts to accumulate something that the IH dealer could not have predicted in 1962 and could not have sold if he had. Cecil ran the rebuilt M through the 1963 season and every season after, maintaining it with the same schedule that had produced a sound crank at 9,000 hours. Oil changes on the calendar, not when he remembered, not when the oil looked dark, but when the calendar said to change it. Air cleaner serviced after every heavy dust period. Hydraulic oil checked weekly. The small things done consistently, the way you do them when you understand that the small things done consistently are the reason an engine survives to be rebuilt rather than being scrapped. In 1975, 13 years after the first rebuild and approximately 6,000 hours of post-rebuild service, Cecil pulled the head again. The compression had dropped on cylinder 3, not dramatically, but enough to be worth addressing before it became a problem. He was 57 years old, and doing the work himself was no longer fast, but it was still possible, and he had decided years ago that as long as it was possible, he would not pay someone else to do it. He pulled the head. He found one burned intake valve on cylinder 3, a carbon buildup on the tops of all 4 pistons, consistent with an engine that had been running slightly rich for a season or 2. He had not gotten the carburetor needle quite right after a float rebuild in 1972, and the slightly rich mixture had deposited carbon without otherwise damaging anything. He replaced the burned valve, ground all 8 valves and seats, decarboned the pistons and combustion chambers, replaced the head gasket, put it back together. He checked the cylinder bore while the head was off. The bores from the 1963 rebuild measured within the service limit. They had worn approximately 0.012 inches in 6,000 hours of post-rebuild service, well within the acceptable range and not yet requiring boring. He left the bores alone. The 1975 valve job was not a full rebuild. Cecil did not count it as one. It was maintenance, intensive maintenance, the kind that requires pulling the head, but maintenance rather than rebuild because the fundamental engine internals remained undisturbed. He started the engine in the spring of 1976. The compression was even across all 4 cylinders. The carbon was gone. The slightly rich running he had been hearing for 2 years was corrected when he reset the carburetor needle after the head was back on. He planted his 1976 crop behind the rebuilt M. It had been on the farm for 35 years. Let me tell you about the almost quit moment for this story, because Cecil had one, and it did not happen in the shop. It happened in a field in August of 1974, in the middle of a harvest run that had been going wrong for 2 days. The Farmall M had thrown a fan belt during the 1974 corn harvest. Not an unusual event. Fan belts wear out. But the fan belt failure had allowed the engine to overheat before Cecil noticed the temperature gauge climbing, and the overheat had produced a slow coolant leak from the head gasket that he had been dealing with for 2 days. The leak was not severe, a weep rather than a gush, but it required topping up the coolant every 4 hours, and Cecil was running long harvest days, and the topping up was an interruption he could not afford, and the fact that the engine had overheated worried him in ways he could not entirely quantify. He was filling the radiator on the afternoon of the second day when his neighbor from across the road, a man named Ed Forrest, stopped his truck at the field edge. Ed had a new Oliver 1755 he had bought the previous spring on a 5-year note. Ed looked at Cecil under the Farmall M's hood. He said, "Cecil, how old is that tractor now?" Cecil said, 33 years. Ed said, "And you're still running it?" Cecil said, "Trying to." Ed said, "I know a dealer in Forsyth who'd give you a fair price on a new one. Might be the time to stop fighting the old one and get something reliable." Cecil looked at the radiator he was filling. He thought about the 1963 rebuild. He thought about what the engine had produced in the 11 years since the rebuild, 11 years of corn and soybeans on 320 Piatt County acres, without a major failure, without a missed planting, without a day of downtime. He hadn't been able to address himself in the shop. He thought about Ed's 5-year note on the new Oliver. He said, "Ed, this tractor just needs a fan belt and a head gasket." He put the radiator cap back on. He said, "I can do a head gasket in an afternoon." Ed had shrugged and driven away. Cecil had finished the harvest run that day. He had replaced the head gasket the following Monday morning. It took 3.5 hours. He had not gone to the dealer in Forsyth. He had never told anyone that Ed Forrest's words had sat with him for 2 weeks after that conversation, that he had looked up the price of a new Farmall 1066 in the fall of 1974 and had held the dealer's quote in his hand for a few days before putting it in the trash. He had thought seriously about it. The numbers, on a farm that was carrying no equipment debt and had $34,000 in the bank from careful saving, were manageable. He could have done it. He had decided he would not do it until the M told him it was done. And the M had not told him that. It had told him it needed a fan belt and a head gasket. Those were not the same message. He told me this 43 years later, at the same kitchen table where he had looked at the price quote in 1974. He said, "Every machine eventually tells you when it's finished." He paused. The M hadn't said that yet. He paused. It took another 15 years to say it. Let me tell you about the third rebuild, because the third rebuild is where the accounting completes itself and where the story earns its ending. In 1989, Cecil Briggs was 71 years old. He had been farming 320 Piatt County acres for 51 years. He had been running the same Farmall M for 48 of those years. The tractor had approximately 18,000 hours on it by his estimate. The original 9,000 pre-first rebuild hours. The approximately 6,000 hours between the first and second significant work, and approximately 3,000 hours since the 1975 valve job. He pulled the head in the spring of 1989 and did his measurement. The cylinders from the 1963 bore were worn to the service limit, 0.030 inches over the new bore dimension from 1963, putting them at 0.085 over original. At that wear level, the piston-to-wall clearance was producing the oil consumption and the morning smoke that told Cecil the engine was ready. He did the third rebuild at 71 years old, alone in the shop that had held every version of this engine since 1962. He bored the cylinders again. The block was still sound. The same casting that International Harvester had poured in 1941 was still straight and uncorroded, the cylinder walls still thick enough to take a third over bore, the main bearing journals still within the service limit and not requiring grinding. He had the head resurfaced again in Decatur. He replaced all 8 valves. He replaced the pistons, rings, rod bearings, and main bearings. He replaced every gasket in the engine. He put it back together in the fall of 1989. He started it in November. It ran the way a rebuilt engine runs, smooth, strong, no smoke, full compression on all 4 cylinders. He drove it out of the shop into the November cold and went around the field once. Then he came back to the shop and sat on the tractor seat for a few minutes without getting down. He had rebuilt this engine 3 times. He had farmed with it for 48 years. He had never bought a new tractor. He owed nothing on equipment that was currently running on his farm. His neighbor, Ed Forrest, who had suggested he buy the new Oliver in 1974, had sold his operation in 1986, not in crisis, not in foreclosure, just ready to be done. Ed had bought 4 tractors since the 1975 Oliver, each one on a finance plan, each one replaced before it was paid off by the next one. Ed had farmed well and left with money, and Cecil did not begrudge him the way he had chosen to do it. But Cecil had also left the farm, or was about to leave it, handing it to his son in 1991. With no equipment debt and a tractor with a rebuilt engine that had just started clean in November of 1989. Let me tell you what the accounting actually says, because the accounting is the argument, and it deserves the full presentation. Cecil paid $1,150 for the Farmall M in 1941. He spent $312 on the first rebuild in 1962 to 1963. He spent approximately $180 on the 1975 valve job. He spent $290 on the 1989 rebuild. Total lifetime investment in the Farmall M from purchase through third rebuild, $1,932. He farmed with it for 48 years. He never bought a new tractor during those 48 years. The M was his primary tractor from 1941 to 1963, and then the primary utility tractor on a 2-tractor operation from 1963 onward, as he added a used Farmall 400 in 1964, also purchased at auction and rebuilt, also never financed. The 400 is a different story for a different video. The cheapest new Farmall M equivalent available in any of the years between 1963 and 1989 was approximately $5,000 in the mid-1960s, rising to approximately $45,000 for a comparable horsepower new tractor in the late 1980s. The finance cost on a new tractor in the periods when farm interest rates ran from 8 to 18% added 30 to 50% to the purchase price over the life of a typical 5-year note. Cecil never paid any of that. The tractor he bought in 1941 for $1,150, rebuilt 3 times for a total of $782 in parts and machine shop work, did the work of a primary and utility tractor for 48 years and was still running clean in November of 1989. Denny Pugh had offered $200 to $250 on trade in 1962 and told him to consider the scrapyard. Cecil had spent $312 on the rebuild and gotten 27 more years of service from the machine Denny had written off. He had then spent $470 more across 2 additional rebuilds and gotten 26 more years beyond that. The total additional service extracted from a machine the dealer said was done in 1962 through 3 rebuilds and consistent maintenance was 53 years. 53 years on a machine the dealer valued at scrap. Let me tell you about what Cecil's son Danny found in the shop when he took over the farm in 1991, because the inheritance of both the machine and the knowledge is where this story closes. Danny Briggs was 34 in 1991, had grown up on the farm, had handed Cecil tools during the 1989 rebuild, and had understood most of what he was watching. He had also done some work on the tractor himself by that point. He had replaced the rear main seal in 1987 under Cecil's direction, had done the carburetor rebuild in 1988 that Cecil had trusted him to complete without supervision. When Cecil handed the farm to Danny in 1991, he had said 2 things about the Farmall M. He had said, "The engine from the 1989 rebuild has maybe 8,000 to 10,000 hours in it before it needs attention again." He had looked at Danny. "You'll be about 45 when it tells you." He had paused. "Listen to it." He had said, "Don't let anyone tell you the machine is done until the machine tells you it's done. Dealers tell you things are done because they need to move product. The machine tells you the truth." Danny has farmed the 320 Piatt County acres since 1991. He has run the Farmall M as the farm's utility tractor since then, not the primary tractor. The primary tractor is a used 1981 Farmall 1586 that Danny bought at auction in 1993 for $14,500 cash and has maintained the way Cecil maintained everything. But the M is in the shop. It runs. It does the work that the big tractor is more than required for. The 1989 engine has approximately 7,000 additional hours on it. The compression is still even. The oil consumption is in the normal range. Danny has not yet heard the message Cecil told him to listen for. He will hear it eventually. He knows what to do when he does. He has Cecil's boring bar. He has the machine shop in Decatur's number in his phone. He has been doing this his whole life. Cecil said, "Don't let anyone tell you the machine is done until the machine tells you it's done." The machine has not said it yet. Denny Pugh offered $200 on trade in 1962 and mentioned the scrapyard. Cecil spent $312 and got 53 more years. Danny will spend what the 4th rebuild costs and get whatever the engine has left in it. The block that International Harvester cast in 1941 is still in the shop. It has been rebuilt 3 times. It has farmed 320 Piatt County acres through parts of 5 decades on the Briggs farm. It has not been scrapped. It has not said, "It's done." Subscribe to The Honest Farmer. Hit the bell. Tell me in the comments, what is the oldest piece of equipment on your farm that is still doing the work? The dealer said, scrap it. Cecil said the engine's tired, not shot. There is a difference. 83 years of farming on one block is the difference. Let me tell you about what consistent maintenance actually looks like across 48 years, because the maintenance is the hidden advantage, and without understanding it, the rebuilds look like luck rather than what they are. Cecil changed the oil in the Farmall M every 100 hours of operation. Not every spring, not every fall, not when it looked dark, or when he remembered, every 100 hours, measured on the hour meter until it died, and then estimated from the season and the work rate after that. He kept a small notebook in the shop where he recorded each oil change by date and his estimate of the hour reading. The notebook was still in the shop when Danny took over in 1991. It had entries from 1941 to 1989. 48 years of oil change records, a continuous maintenance log for one tractor across its entire working life. He changed the oil filter with every oil change from 1953 onward, when the spin-on filter replacement became widely available for the M. Before the spin-on filter, he had cleaned and re-oiled the mesh element filter on the same schedule. The filter was not optional. The filter was the point. Clean oil extended the bearing life. Extended bearing life was the reason the crank was still within specification at 9,000 hours in 1962. Clean oil was the reason the 1963 rebuild produced an engine that lasted 6,000 hours to its first significant work. The oil was the maintenance, and the maintenance was the oil. He serviced the air cleaner, the oil bath air cleaner, in the original M configuration, after every period of dusty operation and at least monthly during the field work seasons, regardless. Dirt in the intake airstream produces bore wear faster than any other single factor except oil contamination, and Cecil understood this. He had seen it on other men's tractors, the scored bores that resulted from letting the air cleaner go. He had not seen it on his own. He adjusted the valves every spring before planting and every fall after harvest. The C264 engine in the M has a side valve design. The valves are in the block beside the cylinders rather than in the head, which makes valve adjustment access easier than in an overhead valve engine. Cecil could do a valve adjustment in 45 minutes. He had done it twice a year for 48 years. That is 96 valve adjustments on one engine. The valve clearances, kept within specification across all those years, prevented the accelerated valve seat wear that kills an engine's compression faster than bore wear. The even compression across all 4 cylinders that Denny Pugh's service manager would have found if he had checked, rather than looking at the tires and the hydraulic leak and pronouncing the machine done, was the result of 96 valve adjustments. This is what a dealer cannot see from the outside of a tractor: the oil change record, the air cleaner service history, the valve adjustment log. These are not visible. What is visible is the tires and the hydraulic leak and the shimmy in the front axle, all of which Cecil agreed were real problems and all of which were addressable and none of which had anything to do with the health of the engine that Denny had called shot. The tires were worn. Cecil replaced them in the spring of 1963 after the rebuild. The hydraulic leak was a worn pump seal, replaced in a Saturday afternoon the same spring. The shimmy was a worn kingpin and bushings in the front axle, a 2-day job that Cecil had done himself by March. The engine was not shot. It was tired. There is a difference. Cecil had said so. He had been right. Let me tell you about the specific conversation Cecil had with Denny Pugh in 1966, 4 years after Denny had offered him $200 on trade and mentioned the scrapyard, because the conversation is the story's first accounting moment, and it happened before either of them expected it. Cecil had brought the M into the dealer in the spring of 1966 for a front axle bearing replacement, a job he could have done himself, but had brought in because he was behind on planting, and the dealer had a faster turnaround than his own shop schedule allowed that week. The M had been running for 3 years on the rebuilt engine. It looked different from the machine Denny had appraised in 1962. The new tires, the clean hydraulics, the front axle repaired. It ran without the smoke and the shimmy that had defined it in 1962. Denny had been in the shop when Cecil dropped it off. He had walked around the M. He had said, "Cecil, this the same tractor you brought in 4 years ago?" Cecil said, "Same one." Denny had looked at the engine. He said, "You rebuilt it." Cecil said, "That winter." Denny said, "What did you put in it?" Cecil told him, "The bore, the pistons, the rings, the bearings, the valves." Denny had been quiet. He said, "What did the machine shop charge you?" Cecil told him the total. Denny had looked at the tractor for a moment. He said, "I told you to scrap it." Cecil said, "You did." Denny said, "You were right not to." Cecil said, "I thought I might be." This was the entire conversation. Not triumphant, not gloating. Denny had looked at the engine, asked the right questions, heard the answers, and said what an honest man says when the evidence contradicts his earlier assessment. Cecil had accepted the acknowledgment without amplifying it. He had picked up the tractor the following day. He had planted his corn. He had used the M for 23 more years after that conversation. Denny had retired from the dealership in 1978. He had come to Cecil's farm once after that, in the early 1980s, to look at some equipment Cecil had bought at an estate auction that Denny thought he might want to purchase. He had seen the M in the field during that visit. He had said nothing specific about it. He had looked at it a moment longer than he had looked at anything else. Cecil had noticed. He had said nothing either. Let me tell you about the financial comparison that Cecil had written out on the back of a tax form in the winter of 1989, the year of the third rebuild, because he had done the arithmetic, and it was the kind of arithmetic that is worth following. Cecil had sat at the kitchen table in November of 1989 with the rebuilt engine running clean in the shop outside, and had written down the total cost of the Farmall M from 1941 through the third rebuild, purchase price, all 3 rebuilds, all significant component replacements, tires in 1963 and again in 1978, hydraulic pump in 1963, kingpins in 1963, carburetor in 1974 and 1988, voltage regulator in 1971, water pump in 1967 and 1981, fan belt replacements across 48 years, oil and filter every 100 hours across approximately 18,000 hours of operation, air cleaner elements, coolant, grease, everything. He had a total. He had then written on the next line, cost of new replacement tractor at comparable horsepower, purchased in 1962 when Denny Pugh recommended the trade, financed at the prevailing rate for 5 years. He had looked at the two numbers for a while. The all-in cost of the Farmall M across 48 years of ownership, including all rebuilds and all significant component replacements, was approximately $4,800 in nominal dollars. Not inflation adjusted, just the actual dollars spent from 1941 through 1989. The cost of a new tractor in 1962, financed over 5 years at the prevailing rate, had he taken Denny's advice, was approximately $3,800, including interest. He would have owned that tractor outright in 1967. He would then have replaced it with another new tractor in the mid-1970s as the first one aged, and a horsepower arms race of that era made it seem undersized for his operation. That second new tractor, financed in the early 1970s, would have cost approximately $18,000, including interest. He would have replaced that one in the mid-1980s for approximately $50,000, including finance costs. New tractors, approximately $72,000 across the same 48-year period, with nothing to show for any of them after the payments were made because each one had been traded in on the next. The M, $4,800 all in, still running in the shop, still in the family, the engine just rebuilt for the third time, and the block sound for a fourth rebuild when the time comes. Cecil had looked at the two numbers for a while. Then he had put the paper in the filing cabinet and gone to bed. He had not made the calculation to prove a point. He had made it because he was a man who liked to know what things actually cost when you added everything up. He had wanted to know whether the choices he had made across 48 years had been the right choices by the arithmetic, and not just by the feeling. The arithmetic said yes, not by a small margin, by the kind of margin that settles a question permanently. He had told me about the calculation 30 years after the fact. He had said, "I wasn't trying to prove anything when I wrote it down. I just wanted to know." He had paused. He said, "The M won." It did, by a wide margin, by every measure that matters in a farm equipment decision. Cost per hour of service, cost per acre farmed, total lifetime expenditure for the function performed. The Farmall M that Denny Pugh had offered $200 to $250 on trade in 1962 and suggested be scrapped had won the argument against the conventional wisdom of new equipment and finance plans by a margin that would have surprised even Cecil if he had not run the numbers himself. He had run the numbers. He had not been surprised. He had expected the M to win the argument. He had just needed to know by how much. By a lot. The block is in the shop. Danny will rebuild it when the time comes. The calculation will get better when he does. Denny Pugh offered $250. Cecil spent $1,932 over 48 years. The math is not complicated. It never was. Let me tell you one thing that Cecil said at the kitchen table that I have not been able to stop thinking about since he said it, because it is the sentence that explains the whole 48 years in a way that the oil change records and the rebuild accounting cannot fully capture. I had asked him why he thought most farmers chose to finance new equipment when the arithmetic so clearly favored maintaining old equipment through rebuilds. He had been quiet for a moment. He said, "A new tractor is a thing you don't have to know." He paused. "An old tractor is a thing you have to know very well." He paused. Most men would rather pay the finance company than spend the time getting to know the machine. I said, and you were willing to spend the time. He said it wasn't spending time. It was what I did. He looked at the window. I knew that engine the way I knew my own hands. After the first rebuild, I knew which cylinder ran the coolest and why. I knew how the carburetor needle changed between July and October. I knew what the valve clearances felt like when they were right versus when they were a few thousandths off. He paused. That's not knowledge you can buy at a dealership. He paused. It took 48 years of paying attention. He said, Denny wasn't wrong that most men would be better off with the new tractor. For most men, the new tractor is the right answer. Because most men haven't put in the 48 years of paying attention that makes the old one worth keeping. He looked at me. He said, I wasn't most men. He paused. Neither was my father. He paused. Danny isn't either. That's the whole thing. The M was not a good choice for most farmers in 1962 when Denny recommended the trade. Denny's advice was correct for the farmer who had not spent 21 years learning that specific engine from the inside, who would not spend the winter doing the rebuild himself, who did not have the boring bar and the maintenance log and the relationship with the Decatur machine shop. For that farmer, the new tractor on a 5-year note was the right answer. It was the honest answer. For Cecil Briggs, who had all of those things, the right answer was $312 and a winter in the shop. The knowledge is the advantage. The knowledge cannot be sold at a dealership and cannot be inherited passively. It has to be accumulated, the way Cecil accumulated it, one oil change at a time, one valve adjustment per season, 2 per season, 96 valve adjustments on one engine across 48 years. At the end of 48 years of that accumulation, you know the engine the way you know your own hands, and the engine tells you what it needs, and you know what the message means. Denny Pugh had looked at a machine he did not know and made the assessment he could make from what he could see. It was a reasonable assessment for the information he had. He was not wrong to make it. Cecil Briggs had looked at the same machine he had known for 21 years and made the assessment that only those 21 years made possible. He was not lucky to make it correctly. The two men were making different assessments from different knowledge bases. Cecil's knowledge base was deeper and more specific and more accurate. The result was $312 versus a 30-year cycle of new equipment finance plans. The result was one block, 3 rebuilds, 48 years. Denny said, "Consider the scrapyard." He meant it helpfully. He meant it from the best information he had. Cecil said, "The engine's tired, not shot." He meant it from 48 years of accumulated knowledge that Denny could not have and that Cecil had not accumulated easily. It had taken 48 years to accumulate. It was worth exactly what it produced: 1 tractor, 3 rebuilds, no equipment debt, and a sound block in the shop waiting for a 4th rebuild whenever Danny hears the message the engine has not yet sent. The block is still in the shop. The knowledge is still in the family. Both of them will be there this spring.